Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and I am also a doctoral student of psychology. Today, I wanted to talk about things that you can do to make yourself more charismatic. Some of these things, if you can implement them relatively quickly, soon after, pretty much instantaneously, will you be perceived as more charismatic, which I think is helpful because some of these things are pretty subtle, which can make a really big difference. The first one is not necessarily so subtle, but once you implement it, I do think it really does make for a more charismatic individual, and there's research on it. This research was done in 2011, and all the research is going to be in the description box, but the first one is actually telling compelling stories. Like I said, research 2011. This actually does activate emotional processing for the individual, the listener, okay? So any narration does actually activate that, and it actually enhances the speaker's impact to connect with the listeners. This is what we found in research. And actually, there's a specific way that the story is framed that does actually increase persuasion, emotional engagement, and perceived leadership. And I'm going to talk about this framing. So, what we first found is that typically it's going to be a relatable or illustrative story. But I found, and you can look at the research and let me know what you found, I found that there is a structure, and some research does follow this as well, particularly the one I mentioned. We see that there's a challenge, right? So you first frame it as being relatable or personable, and then you frame a challenge, which shows up in a way that's relatable to some extent. And then you frame the struggle. And then from that point, you actually frame some form of a resolution. And this structure seems to be something that enhances emotional processing much more significantly for the listener, which does enhance the speaker to be perceived as more charismatic and more leader-like. And so this is the first one. I personally find this one to be one of the most impactful, even if it's not as subtle or instant. However, the other ones will be more subtle, but yet more instant. However, this one, the telling stories one, I feel like is more fundamental, and you can bring that in to yourself as a person, which is why I put it first. The next one is much more instant and I think more simpler to implement. Being curious about the other person actually can be very beneficial. So what do I mean by curious? There's a couple different research that does back this up, and so you can look at that in the description box. But overall, what we're seeing is, just to summarize to some extent or paraphrase what the individual is saying in a reflective way to allow them to feel heard. It can be simply as, so what you're saying is, or what I'm hearing is X, Y, and Z. Did I get that correct? Or you can add it into your perspective while being curious. My perspective is this. What do you think? And so you're allowing the other person to feel like you're engaged in what they're saying. The next one is engage with humor, but it's not self-deprecating. We've talked about this on this channel before, that humor can help with charisma and perspective of being magnetic and attractive, but particularly it's going to be humor that's not necessarily continuously self-deprecating, because a lot of individuals, and I actually feel this way as well, so this might be a little bit more bias, but self-deprecating humor can sometimes make the listener feel confused about how they're supposed to react. So I think this is a little more personal as I described, but I want to share my personal experience with individuals who have self-deprecating humor so that you might be aware of what it sounds like to another person from a personal standpoint. If a person gives self-deprecating humor, let's just say, I'm not good with humor, so it's going to be hard for me to give an example, but let's say the humor is the implication is that they're not going to get the job that they applied for whatever reason. Sometimes for the listener, it's like, do I laugh? Do I, see through their self-deprecation? Do I comfort them? It's really hard to know what to say. And from another angle, this one is not as particular to me. I don't see it like this, but some people do, and it's based on research. They may feel like there's a sense of you saying certain things indirectly and not meaning what you say, or maybe there's some sort of desire for empathy, not empathy necessarily, but attention. And I don't see it as attention seeking, but some people do. And then in general, it can be seen as lower self esteem, which I do agree with. And so that's why humor that's a little bit more positively framed can be more beneficial and be more perceived as charismatic. I know that's not fun for a lot of people because a lot of people do use self deprecating humor, and it does work to some extent. It can be a little bit charismatic, I believe. But I think that rather using positive humor, the same amount of time to use your humor, but it may be a little bit more enhancing for yourself. The next one is actually increase vocal expressiveness. I think that a lot of times what we've seen in the research, particularly 2016, people who have a little bit more of a monotone expression, and it's funny me saying this because I'm a very monotone, very non-expressive person. I know that about myself. I'm not very emotional, at least outwardly and probably inwardly as well. So I'm not saying this in a way where I'm acting as though I'm good at this. I know I'm not. But the research, I'm still sharing the research 2016, charismatic individuals vary in pitch, volume, and speaking rate. Research shows that vocal expressiveness impacts leadership qualities from basically the perspective of individuals are more drawn to the content the individual is speaking about. This is very interesting. However, there's one part of this research that I did find interesting, another research, but I implemented it in both. Sometimes what we can find is some people who are less trusting may find individuals who are like very variable with their tone, they may find that to be manipulative, right? And so there's a little bit of a balance, and you can look at the research. So it does show that vocal cues does strongly predict charisma in both interpersonal and business contexts, but I think it's important to have a balance, which is all I'm trying to say. The next one is develop some sort of emotional expression, but also regulation. Individuals who are charismatic show emotionally congruent expressions. So it's not flat, nor is it exaggerated, which is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. It's effectively communicate your emotions that's regulated based on the environment or the tone that you're with. If you're talking with children, for example, more expression can actually be beneficial. But if you're in a more business-like setting, sometimes being a little bit more direct and more clear, oriented towards the individual's prospects rather than their emotions can be a bit beneficial. So it's dependent on the crowd. Now, if you're trying to tell a story and you want to be perceived as charismatic, leadership, but also magnetic, you might tell a story of something that you conquered and some of the complexities within that conversation, within that compelling story, that narration. So it depends on the people you're trying to convey that towards. And the next one is, some of the research was 2005, excuse me, but in general, a couple more research. Expressing your genuine perspective and adding to the conversation is very important. And I particularly like this one because for me, personally, this builds trustworthiness from the speaker. Like as a listener, I am more trustworthy of individuals who are perceived this way. Maybe not everybody is like this, which is why I put it last, but there is some research on it. For example, if a person says that they believe that part of the reason why divorce rates are as high as they are is because of lack of conflict resolution skills, right? And I believe that, by the way, and there's research on that. But maybe my genuine perspective might be a little bit more angled. And I might say that I do agree with that. My perspective is not just conflict resolution skills, but also knowing when to pick battles. I think that also adds to an element because sometimes I feel that engaging in too much disagreements may, regardless of the conflict resolution, it may create more stress within the relationship than necessary. And so I think sometimes the timing of that argument or disagreement, or whether it's worth bringing it up until another time or evaluating what's better to bring up may be more beneficial or equally beneficial than conflict resolution skills. If not, maybe even less, but still something to be added upon. And so that's my genuine perspective. Obviously, that is not necessarily charismatic in every setting because it's very long-winded, but in certain settings, depending if it's an academic setting, people talk like that sometimes. And so your genuine perspective and who you're talking to does matter, and it adds to the conversation. It does depend though, because I am not a person who is overall charismatic, to be completely honest. In certain settings I can be because I'm confident about how I feel about certain things. I'm just reading the research. I hope this video was helpful to somebody. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.